organized by Estonian concert in Estonian Concert Hall at 7, dedicated to Cage's music. Need 3 ettekannet on meil siis ettekandjad on praegu kell nüüd 11:30 Bowden, siis Raul Keller ja Roomet Jakobi. Aga kõigepealt esimese asjana, the first thing to say is that we have 3 lectures today. We have a lecture by Paul Bowden, and then Raul Keller and Roomet Jakobi. But the first one, then please give a warm welcome to Paul, who will be talking about Cage and his visual creative side. Aitäh, tere tulemast!
Good morning already. Incredible. So, for everything that John Cage embodies, he nearly single-handedly paved a new direction in art. Not just music, but all art. Throughout his lifetime and afterwards, scholars, critics, and audiences have grappled with the complexities of his imagination, philosophy, and aesthetic approach to the making, performing, and reception of art. Though primarily recognized as an American musical iconoclast, Cage's creative efforts found outlet in many art forms: poetry, opera, theater, performance art, film, and in the last 20 years of his life, visual art. Method, structure, discipline, notation, indeterminacy, interpenetration, imitation, devotion, circumstances. These are the 10 words that Cage used to structure his mesostic essay, Composition in Retrospect, and together they form the guideposts to his aesthetic. Cage never repeated his efforts, and nor did he look for formulaic success. Instead, he sought only to move forward in his creative output. To detach himself from his likes and dislikes, Cage turned to chance operations, principally through the use of the I Ching, a Chinese book of oracles that was given to him as a gift by Christian Wolff, a high school student who had come into Cage's inner circle. By the 1950s, Cage had codified his use of chance operations and the I Ching. I use it, Cage says, as a discipline in order to free my work from my memory and from my likes and dislikes. At first, he uses chance operations to create musical works. However, Cage eventually discovers that the possibilities of chance operations can apply to all art forms. From the late 1920s until the early 1930s, Cage divided his time equally between painting and composing music. Despite graduating valedictorian from his high school class, Cage dropped out of Pomona College and convinced his parents that he should study in Paris. While in Paris, Cage worked with the modern architect Erno Goldfinger, and he spent much of his time studying Gothic architecture. In a lecture he wrote called Lecture on Commitment, he said, looking around, it was Gothic architecture that impressed me the most. And of that architecture, I preferred the flamboyant style of the 15th century. After a month of working with Goldfinger, measuring the dimensions of a room he was about to modernize, answering the telephone, and drawing Greek columns, I overheard Goldfinger saying, "To be an architect, one must devote one's life solely to architecture." I then left him, for, as I explained, there were other things that interested me, music and painting, for instance. 5 years later, when Schoenberg asked me whether I would devote my life to music, I said, of course. Returning to California in the early 1930s, Cage found various ways to make a sustainable income and connected himself with a wealthy circle of art collectors. He gave lectures on modern music and art and was able to borrow paintings by Klee and Kandinsky from his friend Gelka Scheer, who had arrived in the Hollywood Hills from the Bauhaus in Vienna. In 1937, Cage worked as a film assistant for the abstract animator Oscar Feinegger, who was experimenting with ways to manipulate the optical portions of film in order to synthesize sound. When Cage moved to New York in 1942, he lived with Max Ernst and Peggy Guggenheim. Shortly after, he became the art director for the Jack Linner Larson Textile Company, where he developed an interest in typography. Cage's work in graphic design strongly impacted the look of his music. On every page of his innovative concert for piano and orchestra, or the aria for solo voice, Cage's skill in creating a beautiful graphic representation of his aural world is evident. Following his studies with Arnold Schoenberg, Cage devised a method of composing that involved rhythmic structures to replace harmonic structures. For Cage, musical structure is its divisibility into successive parts, from phrases to sections. Form is content, the continuity. Method is the means of controlling continuity from note to note. The material of music is sound and silence. Integrating these is composing. He wrote that in the 1949 essay, Forerunners of Modern Music. Dividing units of time into proportional segments was to be an integral part of his working method for works outside of music. His landmark lecture on Nothing and lecture on Something both follow precise rhythmic structures, using text in place of sound to fill the containers. This is a composed talk, for I am making it just as I make a piece of music. It is like a glass of milk. We need the glass, and we need the milk. Or again, it is like an empty glass into which at any moment anything may be poured. For Cage, form was based on content, the content of which would be determined by chance operations. Everything was subjected to this method: texts, images, colors, where to make a cut, or what tool was to be used. Cage's faithful reliance on the answers given to him by the I Ching was rarely altered. Instead, Cage would alter the questions he would ask. Cage first met Marcel Duchamp when he was living with Ernst in Guggenheim, but it would take nearly 20 years before Cage gathered the courage to begin a friendship with him. Duchamp had operated on the aesthetics of indifference, and that anything could be art, provided we gave it attention. This idea was deeply resonant to Cage. Had Marcel Duchamp not lived, it would have been necessary for someone exactly like him to live, to bring about, that is, the world as we begin to know and experience it. Having this view, I felt obliged to keep a worshipful distance. Though I had met him in the early 50s, and in the late 40s had written music for his sequence in Hans Richter's film, Dreams That Money Can Buy. Fortunately, during the winter holidays of 65 and 66, the Duchamps and I were often invited to the same parties. At one of these, I marched up to Teeny Duchamp and asked her whether she thought Marcel would teach me chess. She said she thought he would. Circumstances permitting, we have been together once or twice a week ever since, except for the 2 weeks in Kadak when we were with each other every day. By the way, Kadak is the place where Salvador Dali lived. Marcel Duchamp and Salvador Dali were very, very close friends. Duchamp's death in 1969 gave Cage a reason to create his first visual work, Not Wanting to Say Anything About Marcel. It's a series of 8 plexigrams made in collaboration with Calvin J. Sumison. The work is a set of lithographs printed on plexiglass. Cage called them plexograms. Each of the plexograms consists of 8 panels. 2 are bronzed and 6 are clear, for a total of 64 panels, the same number of hexagrams in the I Ching. The plexograms are mounted on a polished wooden base and are to be arranged in random order. These images were collected from the Random House dictionary and then silk-screened onto the plexiglass. The graphic work was composed, as Cage describes, by using a series of I Ching numbers to answer questions of yes or no, this or that, or how many. Determining I Ching hexagrams is an arduous and time-consuming process. Cage is painstakingly careful and labors intensively with patience and discipline. His precise execution and observation do not make the work random, but rather a fully thought out and constructed work. Even if chance operation dictates that an image or a sound appears outside the frame, its absence is as specific as its presence. As Cage told Robin White at the Crown Point Press, "Most people don't realize I use chance as a discipline. They think I use it, I don't know, as a way of making choices. But my choices consist in choosing which questions to ask. It is the answers to those questions that enable Cage to proceed in making his work." After gathering his answers, he sent them to Calvin Sumison, who then executed the work at the graphic studios of the Hollander Workshop in New York. As Cage writes, "I composed the graphic work and he executed it, just as I would write a piece of music and a pianist would play it." In other words, from moving from music to graphic work, I took with me the social habits of musicians, the division of labor, so to speak, composer to performer. In 1974, Cage composed a large ensemble work with electronic media called Score with 23 parts, drawings by Thoreau. In this work, he superimposes the various drawings of Thoreau on 12 lines in 5 + 7 + 5 segments, mirroring a haiku. This time, the 64-year-old Cage was to make his first etching. For this visual work, Cage replaced the traditionally notated music with Thoreau's small drawings of the natural world. These images were selected at random and with the assistance of the I Ching. Notice there are 12 what looks like measures, and each of these measures is divided into 5 + 7 + 5 segments. In 1977, Cage received a call from Cathan Brown inviting him to work at the Crown Point Press in Oakland, California. Cage accepted and began a working relationship that remained in place until his death nearly 15 years later. For his first day at the Crown Point Press, Cage arrived with Score with 23 parts tucked under his arms. He was not a trained or skilled artist. However, Cage worked diligently to acquire the necessary skill set to begin working fruitfully at Crown Point Press. He would eventually make hundreds of works during the week-long visits he made every year. In making the Score without parts, Cage said, "I had the sense that I was not an artist, that I couldn't draw really anything, but that I had done this, and it would make an etching, and did. Now, I would not say it's a very interesting one, nevertheless, it is something. And then I made a rather interesting thing there, which was called the 7-Day Diary, not knowing. Since I couldn't draw, I decided to close my eyes and draw, so that I wouldn't be embarrassed, I suppose." So human. Brown had invited Cage knowing that he had used the same general approach both in music and in art. In making the complex scores, he would start by asking as many questions as he could think of about the circumstances of the work. Then he would do a number of tests to see what the answers would look like, and if appropriate, would change his skill level. After finding out what tools would be available, for example, he would use the tools to make test lines, and then he would practice with each tool until he could use it fluidly.
Now, we did this. Now we do 8 marks with tool number 1, and one of them is sharp, and one of them is long, and all the rest are medium. And there are 8 altogether. I'm very happy with it. That's great.
Cage's first large series of works at the Crown Point Press coincided with the composition of his Freeman Etudes for solo violin. The Freeman Etudes were a formidable technical challenge, like this clicker. They were said to be unplayable. In writing the work, Cage traced star charts to determine pitch and rhythm, and then consulted the I Ching for all the other parameters, using chance operations to build the full set of 32 etudes. Cage's goal was to make the etudes as difficult as possible so that it aligned with his conceptual motivation to face the practicality of the impossible. The complexity of the Freeman Etudes is echoed in the complexity of the piece called Changes and Disappearances he made at Crown Point Press between 1979 and 1982. Later, Cage would comment that this set of prints is as complicated as things could be, as complicated as, say, the Freeman Etudes. I like them very much. They're probably the most musical, the most detailed work with very subtle changes in colors and shapes. Just as music is made with lots of little notes, so this is made with those little pieces of color. This is the score. These are the directions that Cage had for the artwork. This is one of the pieces. Cage began every work with questions. With Changes and Disappearances, Cathan Brown noted down some of the questions that Cage specifically asked. How many colors are available? How many mixtures is it practical to make? How many different tools are there? How many types of lines? Straight, curved, etc.? And are there ways to make lines besides drawing them? In the case of the last question, Cage's answer was to cut the plates so that their edges made lines, and he dropped string on the plates and traced over it for a different kind of line character. He also added thick black copied lines photographically from drawings done by Henry David Thoreau. In 1983, Cage was invited to work in watercolor by Ray Cass at the Mountain Lake Workshop in Southwest Virginia. This invitation came as a result of Cage leading a workshop in mushroom foraging in the forest of the Appalachian Mountains. Cage loved the area, and in addition to collecting mushrooms, he spent some time collecting rocks for his ever-growing collection. At the end of the mushroom foraging workshop, Ray Cass surprised Cage by bringing him to his studio and allowed Cage to play with watercolor techniques. Obviously delighted with the results, Cage accepted Cass's invitation, finishing nearly 100 watercolors, all devoted to the subject of stones. The work at Mountain Lake is quite different from that at Crown Point Press. First, the process for making watercolors is much simpler, and Cage did not want to repeat the work that he had been making at Crown Point Press. Additionally, Cage did not want to make work with traditional brushes, and instead again turned to the natural world.
All of these things that I'm doing, like my music and my writing even, are done with chance operations. Instead of making choices, I ask a question, and then I use the I Ching, which I now have in the computer. I use that to answer the questions. The implication, if you use chance operations, the implication is that every answer is good.
No, I'll take the tray. Great.
I divided the rocks into 3 groups, the big ones, the medium-sized ones, and the little ones. I did that very roughly. And then I counted the number of rocks in each group. Then I could use the I Ching. If I wanted 15 stones, first I could ask on the number 3, I could ask which ones are small, which ones are medium-sized, and which ones are large. And then when I knew that I needed 5 small ones, and I knew that there was, say, 46 small ones, then I could say which ones of the 46 do I actually use, and so on with the medium and the large. Then when I have my sheet of paper, which sometimes, mostly it came from the nature of the paper, we divided all the paper into 14 differences. The first 3 days, we used first 15 stones because of Ryoanji, and then on the second day, we reduced the number of stones to a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 5. And then on the third day, we went to 1. Now we're back with 15 and multiples of 15. I make a grid either on the whole paper or on part of the paper that is 64 by 64. And that enables me, with the use of the I Ching, to find out where the upper left-hand corner of a rock goes.
Oh, it looks pretty good.
It's nice, isn't it? The first 3 days' work were, all the brushes that we used were feathers. And they started because I was given this brush, which comes from a bird's wing, by Tom Marioni, an artist in San Francisco. And I liked the feathers because of well, it gave me a kind of confidence, because a feather isn't a normal brush. I'm not going to try it. Isn't that beautiful? That has more feeling of the rock than I've been able to get, I think. Well, we have 26 colors, and we have 7 washes. So we use the tables for 7 or 26. And if we want mixed colors, we can mix them either with themselves, or we can mix them, as we did in some of the paintings, or we can mix them with the wash colors, and we can tell the percentage. If I go to the chart of 9, then I can tell whether it's 90% and 10% of two colors, or whether it's 50-50, etc. I can tell which brush to use. In fact, I can tell everything that I ask by means of the chance operations. The only thing I can't ask is the actual movement of the brush. I have to accept what I do.
By 1986, Cage had gained considerable skill working with etching and printmaking. He also worked directly with the paper by crumpling it, staining it with tea and coffee, or even running a car over it. But like many artists, he also ran into blocks and insecurity, falling into a long depression and claiming his life's work was a failure. He finally decided to set the paper he was working on fire. How long the paper would burn, however, would be determined by chance operations. So began a series of works entitled Inenka, which, in addition to the fire-burned paper, used a branding iron to create an enso, a Buddhist symbol said to represent freedom, concentration, and attention to the present moment. The title Inenka is a compound word made from three Japanese words meaning circle, stamp, and fire. This circle, the branding iron, this is the Japanese Buddhist enso.
That's smoking. It's getting a little smoky here.
Get ready, get set, go. That's interesting. Okay.
The limit. It's completely gone.
No, there's
You
some.
found some?
So John, is that an acceptable one, or do you want to do
No,
it
that
over?
would be acceptable. You could try to figure out how to do it.
Constitute the square.
Right.
There's one corner and there's one corner.
Yes. Okay.
Once, when talking about his use of the I Ching to make decisions for his work, Cage said, "The implication is that if you use chance operations, every answer is good. We can infer this that the resulting work is also good, or perhaps it's better to think that there is no such thing as good or bad, just rather one result out of many possible results." It was something Cage was fond of saying throughout his life. Nichi nichi koriko nichi. Every day is a good day, provided you haven't got the motion of pleasing or displeasing in you. Like his music, Cage's visual art is about how individual things coexist into space. The relationship of these points is not to each other, but rather their relationship to the entire space. This was also a nod to his anarchist political leanings. This was in play as early as his imaginary landscape pieces of the late 1940s, and for his landmark recording of Determinacy in 1959 for Folkways Records. My intention in putting these stories together in an unplanned way was to suggest that all things, stories, incidental sounds from the environment, and by extension, beings, are related, and that the complexity is more evident when not oversimplified by the idea of one relationship in a person's mind. Cage was certain that we could each find for ourselves the complex relationships without relying on his interference.
The first question I ask myself when something doesn't seem to be beautiful, the first question I ask is, why do I think it's not beautiful? And very shortly you discover that there's no reason. If we can conquer that dislike, or begin to like what we did dislike, then the world is more open. That path of increasing one's enjoyment of life is the path I think we all best take. To use art not as self-expression, but as self-alteration, to become more open.
Critical remarks on Cage's use of chance operations seem to miss an important point. It was essential to him to discover a way of making art that would free him from his likes and dislikes. And it would free him from relationships found in most art-making and aesthetic paradigms. Cage wanted art to imitate nature in her manner of operation, and to do this had to set himself free from his memory, likes, and dislikes. Every sound must be considered as essentially different and independent of every other sound, Cage wrote in an essay for Modern Music. And for Cage, it would apply to all art. Each and everything, both in time and space, is related to each and every other thing in that same time and space. Relying on the I Ching and chance operations as a discipline act enabled Cage to move forward in his creative work.
What has interested me very much, both in sound and sight, graphic arts and music and so forth, is to experience each sound or each thing we see as itself, rather than as representative of something else, so that when we look even as we do it, two things that we think are identical, if we actually look at them, we see that they're not. The reason they're not is that each thing is itself at its own center, and that center is a center with respect to everything else. So that light, for instance, falls on each Coca-Cola bottle differently. So that if you look at each Coca-Cola bottle with light in mind, you'll see that they're entirely different.
Cage's creative process assists in making work where boundaries are blurred, non-hierarchical, and non-linear. The outcome of his creative work is but one possible outcome of many. Each sound, each word, and each line becomes discovered as it is in nature, acting on its own accord in relation only to the space it occupies. It is a remarkable achievement that Cage discovered a system that enabled him to allow sounds to be sounds themselves. Morton Feldman said, "John Cage was the first composer in the history of music who raised the question by implication that music could be an art form rather than a music form." Cage opened the door, allowing us to discover worlds in, through, and with his work. We continue to experience the thingness of the thing and the myriad of possibilities discovered through chance operations. And yes, there are still so many questions that are searching for answers. Thank you.
Aitäh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So maybe somebody has any comments, questions to Paul?
Paul have you seen the works, the visual works of Cage in
Yes.
original? And you as an artist, what do you think?
I think one of the most important things to understand about Cage is he is asking us to shift our paradigm of how we experience and perceive art. It is not good nor bad. It's just what it is. While in Boston, he made a series of what he called edible papers. These were different kinds of organic materials that were combined by chance operations because he felt that after we were done with paper, we should be able to eat it, which is really kind of funny. And what was interesting was that many of these papers were complete failures. By the time they were done, they had disintegrated and crumpled and basically not usable as paper. Most people, many people, myself included, when we begin to look at Cage's work, begin to look at it with traditional concepts of looking at modern art: balance, form, color harmony. And in order to kind of really get Cage's point, you have to give up that paradigm. And this is really what 433 is about. It's about giving up the paradigm of the concert hall. And most people think that 433 is a joke, but what it is a radical shift in the way we understand what sound is. 433 was inspired by Rauschenberg's white paintings, which are basically white canvases. And what Cage really appreciated was the way the canvases changed as the light hit it. And so this empty frame in art became an empty frame for sound. Hence, any sound that came into this frame was the composition. And this is a radically different way of conceptualizing what sound is, especially in a concert hall that was attended by members of the Society of the New York Philharmonic. The Society. My God.
May I ask a stupid question?
Yeah.
In these interviews, fascinating interviews, what you showed, and also when you spoke about Cage, it was mentioned several times that there is no good nor bad and no judgment we should apply to these works or somehow put it onto that scale. But then I can't avoid thinking about this controversy of us having Cage and him being the one out there and making these works at this Crown Press and people working for him and et cetera, putting him into this very special position, you know, in a good position, let's say, and outstanding position. Why would we need him? I mean, okay, he showed us a certain way or pointed it in music, but why? You know, he actually kept doing it. I mean, he kept doing it as an outstanding artist recognized by the big Philharmonic. You see where I'm headed, you know. I know this has been discussed, but what do you think about it? Because, you know, yes, he does say that we shouldn't look at these works, and you say it as while judging it also, but nevertheless he articulates himself in the context where what is based on that, and then he continues to do so. So he actually seems to be using the context, you know, and in a way he does the opposite of what he says. He actually does produce works himself and puts himself into this special position, whereas he says everything is equal. Do you see a controversy in that, or it's not really a problem? And you know, and again, I realize it might be a very stupid question.
I'm going to say something which touches Estonia, because we can think about Arvo Part. once he found out who he was musically, despite he's creating all these different works, he's continuing his method. And so I think Cage, in a lot of ways, is childlike in his ability to sort of just play and explore. What happens if? Here's a man who, for many years of his adult life, had to go into the forest to find things to eat. He had no money. Yet he died a multimillionaire. That's got to change you somehow. The work is completed by the person who receives it. So while Cage makes the work, it's not done until somebody comes to it. And when you come to this work, you come with your own training, your own experiences, your own sort of aesthetic paradigms. And so it's not Cage who is Cage is asking you to kind of question those things in yourself. I was one of those people who believed he was a clown and a charlatan and a jokester, until one day I finally got what 433 was about, and my brain exploded. So when the paradigm shifts, for example, if you're not academically trained as a musician, say for example you're an artist, you're a poet, and you come to a Cage concert, you experience that music completely differently than somebody who's taken 4 years of harmony and counterpoint. Because that training gives you baggage that you come with. And you superimpose this baggage, Professor so-and-so said no parallel fifths and direct octaves is bad, and yet they abound in Cage's music. And the idea is to sort of free yourself from that, which is so difficult. And in a sense, this is really sort of the root of what Cage's interest in Buddhism is, and that is to just let all things be without judgment, which is so difficult because we love to judge. Nobody has question? Okay, I'm done.
So, aitäh, suur tänu. Aitäh, olgu väike paus ja siis jätkame juba Raul Kelleriga, kes räägib siis David Tudorist. So small break, grab a coffee again, and Raul Keller will continue in a short while. hästi, jätkame selle konverentsiga siin Eesti Nüüdismuusika Keskuses. So let's continue with the conference in Estonian Center for Contemporary Music. Ja järgmisena mul on hea meel paluda lektoriks Raul Kellerit, kes räägib meile David Tudorist. David Tudor on teatavasti olnud väga oluline figuur seoses John Cage'iga, aga mitte ainult, et eelkõige mõeldakse David Tudorist kui nagu Cage'i sellisest ihupianistist või nagu mingil hetkel nagu ühest olulisemast nüüdismuusika pianistist Ameerikas. Aga tegelikult on ta äärmiselt põnev figuur ja ma arvan, et seal oleks nagu rääkida pikalt ja pikalt tema enda loomingust ja ka kas või näiteks sellest, miks ta klaverimängu ühel hetkel jättis. So, I'm glad to introduce you Raul Keller, who will be talking about David Tudor. David Tudor, as we know, mainly to be kind of like the pianist of John Cage and one of the most important contemporary music pianists, at least in North America and actually in the world in certain periods. But maybe less is known about David Tudor's own works and his creative input, and I think there would be a lot to talk about. Also, why did he leave piano in one point? Why did he live this interpreter's life, and why did it all change for him? But I hope we'll know more about in a while. So please welcome Raul Keller.
Hello. So, just as Tavi said, this lecture will be our lecture. It's going to be a sort of small glimpse into David Tudor, and also touching upon him progressing from being probably the central or the key figure, not just interpreter in the 50s for New York School, to progressing to his own work or artistic practice. And this is definitely an artist overview in the way that I'm definitely not a musicologist. So my sort of point of entry to David Tudor is definitely, I think, perhaps imaginary connecting points between his way of thinking and perhaps his sort of understanding how to work with sound, or kind of my relation to this. And it is based mostly on this very nice book that was published a few years ago. I think it's like, I think 2021. So this is David Tudor. Yu Nakai from Japan has written a book called Reminded by the Instruments. I was happy to have it on loan for a longer time. So a very meticulous work documenting David Tudor's artistic practice, performance practice through his instrumentation or the devices he was performing on later in his career. Just incredible amount of detective work. So this is, and also I think the connection to Cage is pretty much in this early in the book is discussed. So I'm basing it on this, and also on lectures I was able to attend this year by John Driscoll and Phil Edelstein from Composers Inside Electronics, the group that Tudor was working with later in his career, or basically that was formed around his Rainforest piece. And Matt Rogalski, who has been writing about David Tudor's artistic practice. Also, he is also a member of Composers Inside Electronics. So yes, and also a bit on Julie Martin, when I come briefly to Billy Kluver's role in transforming the technological scene and in the mid-60s to sort of collaboration between engineers and you could say artists. So I would start by Tudor Timeline. So I've selected this image from Tudor, and it's just, I have a couple of slides here, not a big presentation. So I've selected an image from his later period, like when he was already in his 60s and in his pretty much his sort of working environment, and you could say his modus operandi, or this familiar situation where you could find him, or where students could find him, or where you could find him in a performative practice. So in 1947, at the age of 21, he drew up the facts of his life when he was asked for publicity material. Born in Philadelphia, January 20, 1926, went to high school in Philadelphia, began to study piano at 6 with local teachers. My father was a church organist, and I was so fascinated and attracted by the sound of this instrument that a friend introduced me to H.W. Hawke at St. Mark's Church, one of the largest in Philadelphia, who taught me organ and conventional music theory, harmony, counterpoint, etc. He made me his assistant for 4 years when I was 11 to 15. Afterwards, he sent me out on my own, and at 17 I became organist at Trinity Church, Swarthmore and Swarthmore College. So Tudor passed the exam of the American Guild of Organists at the age of 16, and by 17 he was already working as an organist. And due to the ongoing World War II and the shortage of organists. So during the first year, so I'm just going briefly trying to outline the sort of progression first from one instrument to another instrument, and maybe perhaps the sort of lines that you could draw why or how it happened that he progressed from one instrument to another. During his first year in Swarthmore, Tudor saw Irma Wolpe play the piano and, quote, immediately and spontaneously decided to become a pianist. Wolpe would become his piano teacher. So Tudor's connection to piano was heavily influenced by Irma Wolpe, whose piano playing he has characterized as dynamic, where, quote, she threw her physical apparatus completely into her playing. Also, his piano teacher was an instructor of Eurythmics, seeking to find common ground between sound and body movement, presenting human body as an ideal musical instrument. So Émile Jacques Dalcroze, he has formed the principle of Eurythmics, which is sort of a central practice in Steiner pedagogy, for instance. So you kind of create with your bodily movement, you try to sort of understand and articulate the sound you hear, also at the same time controlling your body, or controlling the muscular activities and tuning them to sort of the sound you hear. So it's like a training of body, basically tuning it to the sound. So it's really important to kind of note that his piano player was both sort of teaching piano and also Eurythmics to Tudor. So for a pianist, there would be another layer of coordination beside coordinating your body and the muscles to the sound, and that was the one of the piano. So it would become a system of two instruments, which were to be synced to each other. Quote, I began to study the mechanics of playing the piano in greater detail. I hadn't paid any attention to it before meeting Irma Wolpe and the concept of Eurythmics. So he began in opening up the instruments and learning the mechanical principles of its action. So when he did that, so this is the notes from the Tudor archives where he has copied the mechanical action of the piano. So at the age of 18 in 1944, he was meticulously studying the mechanics of the piano. So in sort of in line with studying or being immersed in the practice of Eurythmics with his body as well. Quote, then it finally dawned onto me that it's like a lever and there's a point. Technically, it's called the escapement. It allows the hammer to strike the string and then release so that the hammer actually falls away from the string. And if you can find the right point to press into the escapement action, you have absolute control over the dynamics, and as a corollary, you have control over the tone. You can influence the tone. So that's what I was spending my time studying and practicing the piano to enhance my ability to control that. So Tudor describes the difference between, in essence, he's studying the mechanical action of the piano key to find a point of resonance within the piano key so that if he strikes the piano key, he can control the aftertouch in a way that he can actually strike another, make another strike while the chord is vibrating, and he can control with the second strike when he loses his touch on the piano key, so he can influence with another strike where he's sort of pointing this touch either to amplify the vibration or then to subdue the vibration. So he was doing that mechanically. So Tudor describes the difference between the organ and the piano as one having the indirectness in case of the organ and directness in case of the piano. Unlike the piano key, directly coordinated with the hammer, the string, whenever it's depressed, the manuals of the organ create sound only indirectly by opening a valve to let pressurized air go through a pipe. So Tudor considered organ to be a wind instrument and piano to be a percussion instrument. Quote, the revelation of the sensitivity and direct expression of which the piano is capable came as a shock that I can never forget. Many things have since substantiated my decision. If, for instance, one wishes to do something for contemporary music, one must acknowledge the fact that the organ, by its indirectness, lack of vitality, and dated grandiose character, is inadequate for the expression of the extremely complex dynamic and rhythmic inflection of our music. Quote, you see, in my life, I've played other instruments beside the piano. I began my work as an organ player, and that is quite a different sound world. And as I go through life, I like to do things which I haven't done before. Also, I like very much to discover the nature of, to discover natural processes in the way I look at things. For instance, the piano became for me more and more a percussion instrument because that, after all, is its nature. So, in a way, if you approach piano as a percussion instrument, you could, I would draw a similarity between the drum, where if you excite the skin of the drum, then you can basically, by applying inside the resonating system, if you apply pressure or you vary the sort of points where you either lead in or you shift your sort of pressure in the vibrating system, then you can control the sort of articulation through physical feedback. So you can actually, if you play the drum, then you understand that if you're in resonance with the drum, then you can slowly take the pressure away from the system and actually control it more, and then by applying either a little before or later this point of pressure, you can start to create rhythmical and melodic patterns actually. So a direct link here to Tudor's later interest in both the focus on organic systems, articulating the nature of the object through finding the resonance of the object if used in a feedback loop. So you could actually also picture this as a feedback loop where the player is sort of part of the feedback. So it's actually making and this is, I think, complies to the idea of Eurythmics as well, that your body is an organic instrument and the instrument you play is another organic instrument, and if you approach it in a sort of systemic way of a feedback, then you can sort of produce tonal qualities and patterns, and you sort of you can, and I think for Tudor this organic nature of an instrument and approach to music was really important. After having relocated to New York at the age of 22, Tudor continued to study with Irma and his husband Stefan Wolpe, who was a composer and quickly made a name for himself by his abilities to perform difficult scores. So in 1949, John Cage, when he needed someone to record a composition for rehearsals for Merce Cunningham's dance company that was exceeding his own abilities on the piano, Cage made an acquaintance to David Tudor and asked him for help to record soundtrack for rehearsals, having been recommended by other composers, namely Feldman, who was returning with the score of Boulez from Europe. So the story is that Cage just knocked one day on Tudor's door and made acquaintance to him and said that he wants him to play this Merce Cunningham, his piece for this Merce Cunningham's company to tape for the rehearsals. Soon, Music of Changes followed, along with other collaborations with Cage, with Tudor as a performer. So, quote, when I composed Music of Changes, David Tudor applied himself completely to that music. At that time, he was the music of changes. So this is Cage saying that. Other young composers took notice, and pieces specifically written for Tudor as a performer were written by Christian Wolff, Morton Feldman, Earl Brown. Yu Nakai in his book points to an unrealized score written for Tudor by Earl Brown then, which he was unwilling to play, and states that the reason of the failure of the piece to be realized was that by 1952, Tudor had already developed a particular interest in specifying the sonic object within the score himself, and the score by Brown had been too particular about it. Another piece of Brown's written spontaneously for his birthday, so two pieces were written for his birthday dedicated to Tudor. One was Variations 1 by Cage, and the other was Four Systems by Earl Brown, was on the other hand greeted with enthusiasm and repeatedly performed. So by then Tudor was already immersing himself very laboriously into the scores, and I think it's an interesting point already that by already 52 he was sort of deciding whether the material was interesting to him or not interesting to him as a performer. So while composers sought to compose puzzle-like scores that would interest Tudor, the specifics of Tudor's interest, what kind of puzzle he was looking for, remained itself a puzzle. Nevertheless, it was Tudor who had the final say in the possibility of synergy. It was as if composers were all experimenting with an indeterminate instrument, handing it various forms of input just to observe what happened, including, as Brown had learned the hard way, nothing at all. Yunakai. A lot of piano music was written in those years by all of us, and it was written precisely for an instrument that was called David Tudor, if you will, Wolf. There was never any conversation. One assumed he could do everything. In fact, hearing him was proof, Cage. I go to the concert and hear a miracle, Feldman. So this is all comments by the composers who have written scores for him specifically. Nakai goes on to argue that Tudor's preference on the scores was first determined by their objective formal quality, such as paper and the way, for instance, the notes were written on the paper. By careful observation of the matter, and only then interpreted as a score, much like his approach to playing the piano was first by observing the principle of the mechanical action of the instrument and then performing on it. So this is, I think, quite interesting that he sort of, when he received the score, he observed its formal qualities, and he decided upon observing the formal qualities if the piece was playable and interesting to him, and then only then moved on into what was actually demanded within the score. His devotion to new music was due not only, perhaps not even primarily, to new sounds, but to new possibilities for piano playing. That's Holzapfel is saying that also that the scores, he was interested in how to apply new techniques to actually the physicality of the piano with the scores that were written for him. Unless there's a formal structure, the performance is like performing the possibilities which are in front of you. And so what's in front of you becomes the composition, Tudor. Also stating the importance of instruments and objects in the way he works. Nakai concludes by saying that if the instrument changed its nature, so would the music. So the work that can be seen as Tudor's step away from performing other people's scores and start composing his own was Cage's Variations No. 2 from 1961, where his interpretation attained such a level in independence from Cage's set of possibilities as to become an independent work of his own. It's a paradox that Cage had described the work given to Tudor as a gift, as a kind of puzzle, almost impossible to understand. Quote, for Tudor, who not only loved conundrums, but was a genius solving them. So the piece was, quote, a piece entirely due to Tudor's presence on earth. What Tudor did was to coordinate Cage's instructions of the prepared piano into actions of multitude of objects and instruments, and using electronics to amplify them. There needed to be one instrument, but a multitude of instruments, each creating a sound of its own, becoming a study of uncontrollability and unpredictability of a specific kind. Also, the electronics with their stages of gain and particular sonic filtering come to the equation. So, it's a quote from Nakai and Tudor. What defines the works, I think this will probably be interesting because Variations 2 is going to be performed today at the concert. So, which is a different approach that Ensemble U has taken in sort of making their own in determinacy in the system of how the score is created. And Tudor meticulously measured all these, or worked with the score and went through it and sort of decided that there were some kind of, that the way he actually needed to approach it was to break it apart into different instruments and to actually compose with the instruments. As this piece for like the instruments, objects, and the electronics became the sort of piece for him. So this is considered sort of important in a way that it marks the break from performing other people's music, and he did perform some pieces after that, but basically this is the point where he's starting to build his own objects. Prepared piano was in Variations 2 and also electronics. So what defines the works Tudor started performing in the 60s is not less control. Instead, what happened was a change in the primary nature of control from textual to physical. The act of composition became more and more about coordinating discrete objects in space rather than discrete signs on paper. One important realization he had made while realizing Variation 2 was the indeterminacy concerning the number of instruments used. So this is Nakai, and it didn't have to be one instrument, it could have been many instruments. This is Tudor. So he directed his, in this piece, he directed his attention from the one piece, which was the piano, as I understand, to several multiple objects that became in some ways his like a toolbox or instruments. So a quote by Tudor: "There's a paragraph in Busoni which speaks of notation as an evil separating musicians from music, and I feel everyone should know this is true. I had been completely indoctrinated with the idea of faithfulness to notation in early days, and if you think of notation as being complete, then you see what Busoni meant. It can't possibly be complete. Notation is an invention of the devil, and when I became free of it, through pieces like Cage's Fontana Mix and Music Walk, and later Busotti's piano piece for David Tudor No. 3, it really did a lot for me." So he sort of, he has this moment where he understands that he needs to go through this score, or the symbolic score, into the physicality of the score or the objects of the score. Moving on into the mid-60s, I have to say a few words about the person that came up yesterday, also in connection to Variations number 5, Billy Kluver. So, because he's in some ways seminal to David Tudor's new approach to music making, mainly the Bandonian from 1966, presented at the 9 Evenings of Theatre and Engineering. So Billy Kluver, born in Sweden, relocated to New York in mid-50s and worked at the Bell Laboratories as a member of the technical staff for 10 years. So he began to collaborate with artists such as, here you can see Jean Tinguely's Homage to New York, a piece which is a kinetic structure, basically that was devised like a very complex machine that would, in the process of activating it, destroy itself. So Tinguely had asked for this also to include and this is coming from the lecture from Julie Martin, as foul smells as possible, and so that it would actually, it was in the garden of the Museum of Modern Art, and then as a performance it was supposed to be destroyed, but actually something went wrong. He put, I think, it was also supposed to produce drawings, so the initial idea was there's a machine that produces drawings, and then it, in the process, destroys itself, and then explodes, sets itself to fire, and then creates horrible smells, like the most horrible smells imaginable. So Billy Kluver was sort of really hanging out with the artist, as I understand, during this time, and sort of became really interested in the bond between the artist and the performer or engineer, or like a symbiotic relationship between the two. So he started to assist artists in creating their pieces. So this is one example of them. Other examples being that he actually worked with Robert Rauschenberg a lot, also with Jasper Jones, and with Robert Rauschenberg, they came up with this idea of putting together like a group of engineers with artists and sort of create a synergy or some kind of event. And the event was originally commissioned by the Swedish Museum of Modern Art, but it actually fell through. So they actually, what they decided to not to let this waste, they hired this armory of the 69th Regiment in New York and decided to put on this show 9 evenings there of theater and engineering. So this is very really a seminal event in 1962 where several artists and engineers, basically every artist or a composer or a dancer also was appointed a technician or engineer, and then they collaboratively worked on the piece that was to be performed there, and it lasted for 9 evenings in a row. So for Cage's Variations number 5, Cage had also had Billy Kluver and Robert Moog built thereminds and photocells for this performance of this Merce Cunningham's company, so that the dancers would somehow create the music by themselves. So this is the connection to Cage being there, also part of the 9 evenings. And then, of course, Tudor as well. Tudor had before that been sort of introduced to Pandonion, which is this like accordion, but with a lot of these knobs to control it. So it's I think an instrument from Argentina. So, and supposedly Tudor was a big fan of Argentinian tangos, and he visited also Argentina and really fell in love with this instrument. So what he had was basically, he had this, so I'm just going to show, okay. So I'm just going to show an image of David Tudor in this event of 9 evenings. And if we can imagine the space, then the armor was a huge sort of like a building with also arcs like that, and had a very specific, peculiar soundscape. The event is documented in film, in black and white film, but I think there are no good recordings have been made from the period, so it's very difficult to imagine the soundscape, what was in there, but Julie Martin told that basically it was like a delay or reverb effect, the whole place. So Tudor had 4 speakers. Actually, there was 4 radio-controlled platforms for a piece for the dancers, and then Tudor was able to use these 4 platforms and prepare speakers for these platforms with the help of radio transmitting technology. So he was able to move these 4 speakers within this huge space, and it was really huge. The space was able to house cars. So actually cars, during one performance, cars rolled into the space. So he had 4 platforms that were able to be radio controlled, and the speaking elements were actually the drivers from the speakers being sort of like a prepared speakers. So they were not conventional speakers. There were also conventional speakers, 12 of them dispersed around the room, but also they were actually producing sound by vibrating the speaker material. So he was able to control these speakers, and also the sound was going to these 12 additional conventional speakers. So what he had was actually a system of microphones within this Bandonion, And then, as you can see, it was wired with different preamplifiers, and it created basically a feedback system that he was able to control with how much he opened his bandoneon. So by opening and closing the bandoneon, it would start to feed back the system, and it was then mixed by Cage and also technicians on stage to the sound system. And I think Julie Martin said that basically it was a big noise piece, that but which was really incredible in the way that the sound was really multi-timbral, and the whole space started to actually be sort of energized with the sound. So it was quite incredible, this sound. And if you listen to the recording of this, it's very narrow, and it's very, you can't really get any idea about it, because I think the sound recording is made actually from the missing board. So this was, the bandoneon was actually sort of like, was a turning point in where Tudor was, in a way, going to his own practice now with this prepared electronics. So, according to interviews, Tudor was interested from 1965 in finding a means of making objects reveal their own resonant characteristics, rather than using them as instruments to be played manually. He put it this way. One didn't have to think of the generation of electronic music from signal source to the reproducing output, but one instead might just as well start from the other end and go back and arrive at signal source. Tudor described this revelation as an instantaneous dream vision of an orchestra of loudspeakers, each speaker being as unique as any musical instrument. So this is the blueprint of Rainforest, basically, which is his later piece, and which I will just, in a very short, I will just describe it. So Tudor had over the years accumulated different schematics from magazines, mostly Popular Mechanics and elsewhere, which he explored very much as he had done with the piano years before. He slowly familiarized himself with the components within the circuit with basic understanding of their function. He then began to combine circuits with the emphasis of phase shifting and different ideas of feedback within an electronic system. The most convincing arguments for approaching Tudor's work from this perspective are the recurring comments that I have heard in interviews and discussions with his colleagues, that his performance practice was based on experimentation and constant change, that it was a rarity for a piece to be assembled exactly the same way twice, that Tudor's score diagrams, while giving some idea of the principles at work in his compositions, are definitely not to be mistaken for blueprints which might define an authentic performance setup. And also, David Tudor's concert was exploring homemade circuits as inspiration, and that inspiration actually led to the music, versus starting with the composition in your head and saying what instruments can I use to realize the music. There are no scores in the traditional sense of telling what to do at what moment, and in reality those diagrams are the scores. But there's no information there that tells you what to do next. I think the core of the composers inside electronics was this idea that the electronics and the electronic instruments will suggest the direction that you go, and I think that's a very critical point. So John Driscoll from Composers Inside Electronics. So according to interviews, Tudor was interested from So this is by Rogalski, this quote. So Tudor then slowly started to move towards his own practice by actually learning the principles of the electronic elements, how they make up the circuits, and started to combine them. So there's a lot of material where he has gathered like small clips from magazines and places, and then tried to patch them together as ideas how to compose sort of electronic feedback system which he can control on stage. So it's the beginnings of the performer, the solo electronic performer. And I think it's important to note here that it's also very important that very much like the piano is sort of inspected as for its formal qualities, also the sort of the electronics is also in a way as a score. It becomes a score. So there's no master score that says that I need to do this or that, and this is the composition, and here's where you can apply, you know, the dynamics or whatever. So, and now I will just end it with the Rainforest Series, which is then something that he did from the end of 60s onwards. So Rainforest 1 was a duo which was devised for Merce Cunningham Dance Company, and which actually gave the name to the series in. So this is a schematic from Rainforest from 1973, but this is Rainforest 4, so this is the final version of the Rainforest. Also to note with the schematics that Tudor has, this book is basically about deciphering the schematics, because the schematics often are just ideas how it could work, but you cannot actually build any instrument from these schematics. It's more like an idea or a concept how something could work in a concrete situation. Yes, exactly. A block scheme of how you would excite an object, a physical object. So, so actually the name Rainforest comes from Merce Cunningham Dance Company's performance for which Tudor was commissioned to make the sound or music, if you will, in 1968, and then it was performed by Tudor and I think Cage. So I have to look up because it was a duo, and then it was a multi-channel piece, and it was always changing. Like it didn't have a concrete sort of structure. So I think this resonates with what we heard yesterday from this Warsaw Spring concerts, that the dances of the Merce Cunningham Company and Cage's music was not synchronized. That there was some kind of other correlation between the movements and sound. That it actually was some sort of there was a connection, or there was a logic behind it, but it wasn't definitely illustrating, or so it wasn't a rhythmic or some kind of other parametric correlation between both of them, because Tudor was very explicit not to repeat the performance ever twice. So Rainforest 2 was a collaboration performed with John Cage, which is a lesser documented version of Rainforest, where John Cage's voice activated the instruments. Rainforest 3 was double performances with John Cage, where Cage was performing his Moreau, which is a chanted voice singing piece. And then Rainforest 4 is then this piece that has the schematic here, and which developed then into strange. Okay, I kind of see it, but I don't know. It's probably yeah. It's okay. Anyway, I can show this because this is Rainforest 5 actually, but this is a derivate from Rainforest 4. It's pretty similar, and I think it still has some of the original objects. So in 1973, now we're moving into the 70s, there was a workshop where David Tudor had a workshop with students of actually various artistic backgrounds. The participants were, for instance, John Driscoll, who had a sculptural background, Phil Lederstein, Bill Viola, if you perhaps heard the name, is a famous video artist, Martin Calve, then yeah, So there were several students that actually worked together with Tudor. So Tudor supposedly just presented them with very simple instructions. I think I have it here. Yes. So the character of the Rainforest 4 was defined by the workshop, which created for it the conditions to happen. In the workshop of 1973, there was a balance of direction and freedom, with the direction being minimal, as described by John Driscoll and the other participants. On the other hand, the freedom was given by Tudor's very basic introduction and invitation to experiment, which led to an expression of the piece that was even a surprise to him. Larger objects with sculptural presence being brought into the place where the first presentation was made, and active construction of the compound objects by participants. So what happened was that David Tudor introduced this group to a principle of feedback, of resonating objects and finding like a sort of feedback loop, and learning to listen to the object, and then gave them freedom to work and find their own objects. And probably what he had in mind was that it would be a minimal setup, but instead, because of the participants were of varied background, they actually brought huge objects in there. So it quickly became an installation piece, which was then modulated by these exciters in a feedback loop, and the sound being picked up with piezo microphones. So it evolved into an installation sound piece. So, but it wasn't just a sound piece, it was also a performance, like a concert installation. So, so it was thought of as a performance where you would then set up the objects and the instruments in a space, and then everybody would play their instruments, and it was all mixed together in a space as a collective or as a group. So as Matt Rogolski said, that Tudor later really loved collaborations. So he was really interested in getting the people into a group exploration, experimenting with the objects. So Tom Johnson from Village Voice writes about the Rainforest 4 performance by Tudor and the participants of the workshop. The process kept me interested for a couple of hours. It kept the participants of the workshop and Tudor interested for 5.5 hours. They were not trying to press a point, as people were free to come and go at will. They enjoyed in keeping the sounds going for those who wanted to stay and for those who came back later on. I suppose they were also having an enjoyable time feeding various sounds into various objects, testing how the objects responded to different things, trying to find resonant frequencies and listening to subtle variations. And this aspect of acoustic and electronic curiosity is the central part of the piece for me, and a shared interest among performers for these things seem also be a part of the piece satisfying collective Rainforest. So, in a way, the piece Rainforest is created by all the participants being involved in performing the piece. I tried to think of what we're doing there that people don't do, and one thing is that we first of all build equipment, think of what's inside, and what is it that we would like it to do or can do, instead of using components as givens like university composers. Ha ha. It's Tudor then. It's amazing. Kids go to school and get their hands on all of that expensive equipment and don't have the experience of starting from nothing. We do our own stuff. We've had several series. It was just a means of really getting a large group. That's the only thing I can come up with that would express my opposition to synthesizers, etc. They were a good group, and I especially appreciate the fact that they all came from different disciplines. The grace of Rainforest is that it allows entry by almost any group and tends to self-moderate. The importance of a leader is not a given, But if the group doesn't have a sensitivity to broad boundaries of the piece and the goal of collectively creating what Tudor called an electronic ecology, it runs the risk of being a space for showmanship and outdoing one another with loud and aggressive sounds. This has happened on occasion with student groups, including one at the University of Electronic Music students that Gordon Mama described as a war. Clearly, this works against the idea of developing an ecosystem of sounds that support each other and allows sonic transparency where everyone can be heard. So this is from Matt Rogalski's presentation and from John Driscoll. I wish to God that the performers would understand that because they get so carried away with the fireworks that can happen in the sculpture itself, that they don't pay attention to the tonal balance. And when you got like 6 people doing that, it can get pretty wild. It's at its best when it remains calm. Tudor. So this would be my presentation. Thank you.
Aitäh. So I feel that there is much more to discuss or to discover with David Tudor, and I hope to continue it someday here, maybe elsewhere. Et mulle tundub, et siin David Tudori siis loomingust oleks nagu veel palju rääkida ja kajastada, et ma loodan, et me jõuame selleni siin Nüüdismuusikakeskuse ruumes või siiski mujalgi. But before we end with Rahul, would anybody have any questions or comments or would want to say something? Yeah, Paul.
Maybe I'll say one thing to inspire others who are interested in this world. This is about the same time when electricity moves into popular music, especially American popular music, and there's a great connection between what Tudor and Cage is doing with people like the Grateful Dead or the Beatles or Jimi Hendrix even. So it's really interesting to look at this very intersection between what we might think of as high art and popular art and how they come together during the 60s. This has a lot to do with the political and social landscape of the 60s, not only in the US but around the world. So you can find these things in Poland, you can find these things in France, you can find it even in Mexico, who had a tremendous explosion of avant-garde art in the mid and late 60s. So open your door and take a look.
Aitäh. Thank you. So I would propose we make a short break, and we have one final presentation today by Roomet Jakobi, and this will be something completely different, I promise. So, small break. Aitäh. Thank you.
heli tuleb läbi? Kas ta tuleb ka niisuguses asendis läbi millegi?
Lo and behold, the horse turns into a prince, who, except for the quiescence of the hero, would have had to remain a miserable shaggy nag. I have noticed something else about Christian Wolff's music. All you can do is suddenly listen in the same way that, when you catch cold, all you can do is suddenly sneeze. Unfortunately, European harmony. Where it is, within us, but like an empty glass into which at any moment anything may be poured, just something, finitely something, or even to be able to drink a glass of water, unless some other idea crops up about it. That is all I have to say about structure. My present way of composing's involved with the observation of imperfections in the paper on which I happen to be writing. About the prepared piano. Each prepared piano is prepared differently. Objects are placed between the strings and the piano sound. To all of these various characteristics, he is transformed with respect to all of its characteristics. Music is an oversimplification of the situation we actually are in. An ear alone is not a being. Music is of one part of theatre. Focus is what aspects one's noticing. Theatre is all the various things going on at the same time. I have noticed that music is liveliest for me when listening, for instance, doesn't distract me from seeing. One should take music very naturally. No technique at all. Only technique worth having. I remember being asked what I thought about technique, and at first I had nothing to say. Several days later, I realized I have no time for technique because I must always be making one. Any technique can be discovered after any technique is forgotten. Another technique I've devised is derived from the I Ching method of obtaining oracles, and a principle, also I Ching, which interested me not at all anymore, is that which is called mobility-immobility. Time, which is the title of this piece. So many minutes, so many seconds is what we are sounds happen in, whether early or late in it. It is not a question of counting. Our poetry now is the realization that we possess nothing. Anything, therefore, is a delight, since we do not possess it, and thus need not fear. This composition involves a flexible use of the number 10,000. That is to say, 100 times 100 square root. The actual time lengths are changing. This work has no score. It should be abolished. A statement concerning the arts is no statement concerning the arts. It consists of single parts. Any of them may be played together or eliminated at any time. To me, teaching is an expedient, but I do not teach external signs. Like a long book, if a long book is like a mobile, the ignorant, because of their attachment to existence, sees unsignified or signifying. No beginning, no ending. Harmony, so-called, is a forced abstract vertical relation which blots out the spontaneous transmitting nature of each of the sounds forced into it. It is artificial and unrealistic. Form, then, is not something of in the distance in solitary confinement. It is right here, right now. Since it is something we say about past actions, it is wise to drop it. This, too, giving himself and his quest up to the aimless rolling of a metal ball, the hero unquestioningly does. They proceed thus by chance, by no will of their own, passing safely through many perilous situations. I begin to hear the old sounds, the ones I had thought worn out by intellectualization. I begin to hear the old sounds as though they are not worn out. Silence, like music, is non-existent. There always are sounds. That is to say, if one is alive to hear them. Obviously, they are not. Whether I make them or not, there are always sounds to be heard, and all of them are excellent. We bake a cake, and it turns out that the sugar was not sugar, but salt. Are you deaf by nature, choice, desire? Or can you hear externals, timpani, labyrinths of whack? By no means. The 12-toned row is a method. A method is a control of each single note. Their development, the climax, the recapitulation, which is the belief one may own one's own home. There is too much there. There is not enough of nothing in it. So far, I have written 2 parts for a pianist. Either part can be played alone, or they can both be played together. Each piano is prepared differently, although, as a matter of focus, the parts could be played without bothering to prepare the piano or pianos. If prepared, then generally the preparations will be altered in the course of the performance. The principle called mobility-immobility is this. Everything is changing, but while some things are changing, others are not. Eventually, those that were not changing begin suddenly to change, et vice versa ad infinitum. A technique, to be useful, skillful that is, must be such that it fails to control the elements subjected to it. Otherwise, it is apt to become unclear, and listening is best in a state of mental emptiness. Composers are spoken of as having ears for music, which generally means that nothing presented to their ears can be heard by them. Their ears are walled in with sounds of their own imagination. Of 5 aspects, observe 2. The highest purpose is to have no purpose at all. This puts one in accord with the nature in her manner of operation. If someone comes along and asks why, there are answers. However, there is a story I have found very helpful. What's so interesting about technique anyway? What if there are 12 tones in a row? What row? This seeing of cause and effect is not emphasized, but instead one makes an identification with what is here and now. He then spoke of 2 qualities, unimpededness and interpenetration. The relationship of things happening at the same time is spontaneous and irrepressible. It is you yourself, in the form you have that instant taken, to stop and figure it out that takes time. The only thing, pardon me, that I do not find. The preparation of the pianos is also determined by chance. The various materials that exist are placed in the following categories. P, meaning plastics, bone, glass, etc. M, meaning metal. C, meaning cloth, fiber, rubber. W, meaning wood, paper. X, meaning other materials, special circumstances, free choices, etc. Coins are then tossed. Forms not the same twice. Sonatas, fugues, that 2 or more things happen at the same time is their relation. The beginning of this work in progress was not a part for a pianist, but curiously enough, 6 short parts, no one of them lasting much more than a minute, for a string player, that is, a 4 strings player. Surely, things happening at different times are also related. If it needed to be clear, magnetic tape makes it perfectly so, that we are not in a 12-tone or any other discrete situation. The reason I'm presently working with imperfections in paper is this. I am thus able to designate certain aspects of sound as though they were in a field, which, of course, they are. The sounds that had accidentally occurred while it was being played were in no sense an interruption. More and more I have the feeling that we are getting nowhere. Not wondering, am I right or doing something wrong? The preparation changes that occur during a performance are A, simple change of position, B, total or partial addition of objects, C, total or partial subtraction. Nothing has been said about Bach or Beethoven. We are the oldest, it makes the silence, at having our airway of knowing nowness. Years ago I asked myself, why do I write music? An Indian musician told me the traditional answer in India was to sober the mind and thus make it susceptible to divine influences. Same answer is given by some old English composer. Consider this non-dualistically. He goes by me, I see him not, he passes on, but I perceive him not. These pieces take into consideration the physical action of playing an instrument. You won't find this in the books. Why do you not do as I do, letting go of your thoughts as though they were the cold ashes of a long dead fire? What has taken the place of the mobility principle now that I am no longer interested in it? 3 coins tossed 6 times yield a hexagram, of which there are 64. In this way, one can establish which of the 64 possibilities obtains, and changes. What better technique than to leave no traces? To determine the number of imperfections in a given space, coins are tossed. That number of spots is then potentially active. Subsequent tosses determine which are actually active. Tables are arranged referring to tempi, the number of superimpositions, that is to say, number of things that can go on at once, sounds and silences, durations, loudness, accents. Sounds together, suffice it to say. Structure is of no importance, however. I go on having it by chance to determine first the the relative probability of the three, and then to determine which of the three happens in the world for studying music. It doesn't seem to me to affect anything that happens in it. I am speaking, of course, about a time structure. It simply allows anything to happen in it. What I am calling poetry is often called content. I myself have called it form. It is the continuity of a piece of music. Continuity today, when it is necessary. A fugue is a more complicated game, but it can be broken up by a single sound, say, from a fire engine. Now, getting sleepy and so on. Very frequently, no one knows that contemporary music is or could be art. He simply thinks it was irritating. Irritating one way or another, that is to say, keeping us from ossifying. It may be objected that from this point of view, anything goes. Actually, anything does go. But only when nothing is taken as the basis. In an utter emptiness, anything can take place. The feeling we are getting nowhere. That is a pleasure. Why? Which will continue. The way to test the modern painting is this. If it is not destroyed by the action of shadows, it is genuine oil painting. A cough or a baby crying will not ruin a good piece of modern music. This is A's truth. As contemporary music goes on changing in the way I am changing it, what will be done is to more and more completely liberate sounds. Of course, you do know structure is the division of whatever into parts. Last year, when I talked here, I made a short talk. That was because I was talking about something. But this year, I am talking about nothing. And of course, we'll go on. Magnetic tape music makes it clear we are in totality actively. Upaya. Let your ears send a message of surprise or perplexity. That's the way. Was asked, Dr. Suzuki, what is the difference between men are men and mountains are mountains before studying Zen, and men are men and mountains are mountains after studying Zen? It is not a question of going into oneself or out to the world. It is rather a condition of fluency that's in and out. Need I quote Blake? Certainly not. Spots are spots, and skills needed to turn them to the point of practicality. Tape music requires multiple loudspeakers, and it seems to me I could listen forever to Japanese shakuhachi music or Navajo, yebitachai, or I could sit or stand near Richard Lippol's Full Moon any length of time. But those beauties, formerly for me, time length was a constant. Now it too, like everything else, changes. Beginning of the third unit of the fourth large part. Yes, it is. Masterpieces and geniuses go together, and when, by running from one to the other, we make life safer than it actually is. We are apt never to know the dangers of contemporary music. When I wrote The Imaginary Landscape for 12 radios, it was not for the purpose of shock or a joke, but rather to increase the unpredictability already inherent in the situation through the tossing of coins. Chance, to be precise, is a leap, provides a leap out of reach of one's own grasp of oneself. Once done, forgotten. One thing to do with time is this: measure it. Cultivate in yourself a grand similarity with the chaos of the surrounding ether. Unloose your mind, set your spirit free, be still as if you had no soul. Everyone returns to its root and does not know. If they knew, they would be leaving it. Structure. Given a number of actually active points, they are an aggregate, a constellation. They can move about among themselves, and it becomes necessary to classify the kinds of aggregates, say constant and again intermittent. One can hear a sound. I wrote some music for Carillon, for Mary Carillon Richards, using differently shaped scraps of paper, folded and small holes cut in them at the points of folding. Then used these as stencils at points in time-space, each ink determined. If you are interested, you can read a detailed description of it that will appear in the forthcoming issue of Transformation. When I first tossed coins, I sometimes thought, I hope such and such will turn up. Earth's no escape from heaven. How can we speak of error when it is understood psychology never again? It should be clear from what I am saying that one's one. Counterpoint is the same proportion as harmony, except that it is more insidious. I noticed in 1938 that some young people were still interested in it. Greater earnestness is required if one is going to solve the really important problems. My point is this: various techniques can go together all at the same time. Therefore, this work, I am using the word progress, with which in connection has no organizing technique supporting it. Giving up counterpoint, one gets superimposition. And of course, a little counterpoint comes in of its own accord. How I wouldn't know. The best thing to do about counterpoint is what Schoenberg did. Teach it. I am still really thoroughly puzzled by this way of composing, by observing imperfections in paper. It is this being thoroughly puzzled that makes it possible for me to work. I'm puzzled by hearing music well played too. If I'm not puzzled, it wasn't well played. Hopelessly incomprehensible. While studying music, things get a little confused. Sounds are no longer just sounds, but are letters. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. At the end of the journey, when success is almost in view, I know nothing. All I can do is say what strikes me as especially changing in contemporary music. Unfortunately, European thinking has brought it about that actual things that happen, such as sudden listening or suddenly sneezing, are not considered profound. Not just tones, noises too. What is the physical action involved in playing an instrument? Yes! For instance, now my focus involves very little. A lecture on music, my music. But it is not a lecture, nor is it music. It is, of necessity, theatre. What else? If I choose, as I do, music, I get theatre. That is, I get that too. Not just this, the two. Art, as art, is order or expression or integration of these. It is a light, the Chinese say, but there is darkness. What is now unheard of is an 8 loudspeaker situation, to be in the center of transmission, sounds coming from every direction. After 8, give me 16. Where is the best position for audition? The corner where you are. It is understood that everything is clean. There is no dirt. Then why are you always taking baths? Just a dip, no way. For me, it is a matter of getting up and daily unless commitments. That is finished now. It was a pleasure. And now, just the same, only somewhat as though you had your feet a little off the ground. Now, at the beginning, before studying music, men are men and sounds are sounds. This causes some hesitation on the hero's part, but he finally acquiesces. One of them said he must have lost his favorite animal. Another man said, no, it must be his friend. Do you only take the position of doing nothing and things will of themselves become transformed? Think for a moment about sound, how it has pitch, loudness, timbre, and duration, and how silence, which is its non-existent opposite, has only duration structure. Error is drawing a straight line between anticipation of what should happen and what actually happens. What actually happens is, however, in a total not linear situation and is responsible generally. Therefore, error is a fiction, has no reality in fact. Errorless music is written by not giving a thought to cause and effect. Any other kind of music always has mistakes in it. In other words, there is no split between spirit and matter. And to realize this, one has only suddenly to awake to the fact. This makes possible the writing of such durations as 1/7 plus 1/3 plus 3/5, all fractions of a quarter. This brings about an emphasis on uniqueness, so that two nearly the same durations can each be uniquely itself, just as two leaves, however much of the same tree are not identical. If there is time, I will tell you about my visit to an anechoic chamber at Harvard. It was not silent. Two sounds, one high, one low. The privileged tones that remain are arranged in modes or scales, or nowadays rows, and an abstract process begins called composition, express an idea. The only structure which permits of natural activity is one so flexible as not to be a structure. I write in order to hear. Never do I hear and then write what I hear. Inspiration is not a special occasion. After studying music, men are men and sounds are sounds. And subtract. That is to say, at the beginning one can hear a sound and tell. In the direct situation, it is, if you don't like it, you may choose to avoid it. But what silence requires, isn't it? What I think and what I feel can be my inspiration, but it is then also my pair of blinders. To see, one must go beyond the imagination, and for that one must stand absolutely still, as though in the center of a leap. Several stories occur to me that I should like to interpolate, in the same way, by the way, that while I am talking, the telephone keeps ringing, and then contemporary conversation takes place instead of this particular way of preparing a lecture. It is high or low, has a certain timbre and loudness. I will not disturb by my concern the structure of anything that is going to be acting. To act is a miracle and needs everything and every me out of the way. An error is simply a failure to adjust immediately from a preconception to an actuality. However, it occurs to me to say more about structure. Specifically this: we are now at the beginning. Or not. And it isn't a human being or something to look at. It is high or low, has a certain timbre and loudness, lasts a certain length of time. And it is necessary to see that there is not only a sharp distinction to be made between composing and listening, but that although all things are different, it is not their differences which are to be our concern, but rather their uniquenesses, and their infinite play of interpenetration with themselves and with us. There are three categories of noises in the two parts for two pianists: those produced inside the piano construction, outside the same, and accessory noises, whistles, percussions, etc. Reading music is for musicologists. There is no straight line to be drawn between notes and sounds. Vertically, in the same space, any range will appear. It was originally for me a matter of flexibility by means of changing and not changing tempi. The matter reduces itself, however, to time, which is short or long, and that to a process of multiplication using a variety of multiplicands. Communication, if it is required, is a way of calling attention to one's own psychology. If permitted, it takes place of its own accord. Is, for all the world, inevitable. If it were the same purpose as when it has to do with another leaf, it would be a coincidence, imitation of nature from which each leaf should hold on to the complete rule, which would be free because it adds in her manner of operation. Then it will not be of its own unique position in space uniqueness, plagiarism of result, having a particular suchness, but active from before operation begin, is extremely close to being here and now. So that listening one takes as springboard the first sound that comes along. The first something springs us into nothing, and out of that nothing arises the next something, etc., like an alternating current. Not one sound fears the silence that extinguishes it. But if you avoid it, that's a pity, because it resembles life very closely, and life and it are essentially a cause for joy, people say sometimes timidly. Organized ways of predicting the weather, say, for instance, it is in all of its acoustical details. For a calculated theatrical activity, I would say offhand that the minimum number of necessary actions going on at once is 5. Bright people can clear up rather quickly, perplexity arising from lower numbers. Modern intervals, but in order to have them, the mind had fixed it so that one had to avoid having progressions that would make one think of sounds that were not actually present to the ear. He is most utterly indebted, not one who struggles to force his idea, and who would have had to remain, I have noticed. Calculated actions that are to go on together need to have been composed in the same way. One runs the risk of falling into a marasm of idea if one goes on composing without discovering. Turn on several radios at once. There, again, one has a multiple loudspeaker system. Besides actually being in space, the mind no longer can function as ABC. Theater takes place all the time, wherever one is ease, and art simply facilitates persuading one this is the case, so that this ignorance I speak of is not losing sensitivity responsiveness. On the contrary, it is a question of when, now. Flee she up or flee she down. It acts in such a way that one can hear through a piece of music that just as one can see through. Echoes, breaking, varying its speed, and synchronized. Skillful means has a good deal to do with multiple division of process. And here, for instance, we begin to be in a state of immobility. Anyone can see the desirability of mobility. Had I had nothing to say, it would have been different. All it is now is what it is, faster and slower. It is the space between the loudspeakers that is to be considered from a desire for clarity great. We carry our homes within us, which enables us to fly. Each moment presents what happens. I derived the method I use for writing music by tossing coins from the method used in the Book of Changes. It may be objected that from this point of view anything goes. Actually, anything does go, but only when nothing is taken as the basis. In an utter emptiness, anything can take place, and needless to say, each sound is unique, had accidentally occurred while it was being played, and is not informed about European history and theory, keeping one's mind on the emptiness, on the space. One can see anything, can be in it, is, as a matter of fact, in it. Where no sense in interruption, I have noticed I needed a way, something else. This causes some hesitation. Hero would have had to remain, now knows he is most, asks the hero to kill him. 3 kinds of them. It was by means of words we become subservient. The central point is everywhere receiving and transmitting. What is passivity? Only one monk in the monastery, the oldest one, wrote a poem, but he stayed up night and day deliberating on it. The other monks didn't try because they were certain the oldest one would win. When his poem finally came out, it said, continuity takes place of its own accord, and things do go on at the same time. All of this is correct and true. There is no concern necessary for, say, intonation, counterpoint, scales going to and coming from, and then when. An abstract process begins called composition. That is, a composer uses the sounds to express an idea. What then are you standing up there for if you say no to all of our questions? The man on high said, I just stand if there are no questions. This means for me knowing more and more, not what I. If it is on paper, it is graphic, calligraphy. If you can hear and see it, it is. There are no answers. Then, of course, there are answers, but the final answer makes the questions seem absurd, whereas the questions, up until then, seem more intelligent than the answers. Somebody asked Debussy, have you not lost your friend? No, sir, I have not lost my friend either. Is it interesting? It is and it isn't. But one thing is certain, they are, with respect to counterpoint, melody, harmony, rhythm, and any other musical methods, pointless. All that is necessary is an empty space of time and letting it act in its magnetic way. Eventually, there will be so much in it that whistles. In order to apply it to all of these various characteristics, he necessarily reduces it to numbers. He has also found a mathematical way of making a correspondence between rows. I remember as a child loving all the sounds, even the unprepared ones. I like them especially when itself in the jaws, cheeks, and tongue, and the commentary says, the most superficial way of trying to influence others is through talk that has nothing real behind it. The influence produced by such mere tongue wagging must necessarily remain insignificant. I believe that one can arrive at directing the phenomenon of the automatism of chance, which I mistrust as facility, which is not absolutely necessary. For in the end, in interpolations and interferences between different rows, when one of them passes from time lengths to pitches, at the same time that another passes from intensities to attacks, etc., there is already a sufficiency of the unknown. Diminishes his love and increases his fear and concern about what people will think. There is all the time in the world for studying music, but for living there is scarcely any time at all. For living takes place each instant, unimpeded. There are 2 great dangers for magnetic tape. One is music, all the history and thinking about it. and the other is feeling obliged to have an instrument. One is Pacific, 231, 1954, and the other organ music. If you are interested, you can read a detailed description of it. If there are 10 things to do, and I only do 2 of them, focus have changed. In his ear, where he will find a metal ball to toss it on the road in front of them, so that as the horse goes on to say, we may be led by it. This too, giving himself. Is there anything else to say about structure? Yes, it goes on, supporting everything. Its only difficulty lies where struggle to support is already in process. Fearing what? Any kind of paper will do for seeing spots in it. When one gets around to copying on a second sheet what was given by a first, it becomes clear. What? Magnetic tape, as being all interesting, can disappear. There are rumors of machines and cards. Let us move, however, for unpredictability. A structure is like a bridge from nowhere. If something with respect to something else happens, sooner or later everything is different, but essentially nothing of any permanent importance has happened. I am talking, and contemporary music is changing. Like life, it changes. If it were not changing, it would be dead. That is why chance enters for me so largely into my means, which are skillful. It is at the point of potentiality. I am working now to work without charts, without any support in total space. I see now by many slow transitions, one of which is tempo-like streams, varying and not varying, that as long as one discriminates, as I formerly did, problems remain. Each one of us is thinking his own thoughts, his own experience, and each experience is changing. And while we are thinking, to get yourself in such a state of confusion that you think that a sound is not something to hear, but rather something to look at, I am happy about all the experiences I have had with the prepared piano. For one thing, it showed me how different 2 pianos are from one another, and music, so-called, makes us think 2 pianos are the same. It isn't true. It is tossed out. It just happened that the series of numbers, which are the basis of this work, added up to 100 times 100, which is 10,000. This is pleasing momentarily. The world, the 10,000 things. But the title is simply minutes and seconds. Questions to ask you. How do you need to cautiously proceed in dualistic terms? A, B. Just as going from here to Egypt is a single trip, but a more or less complex series of experiences, or just as Chinese characters are some written with 1 stroke, but others with 2 or several or many. And not in the way we need for living. For instance, someone said art should come from overhead. There was a social calendar and hours for breakfast, but one day I saw a cardinal, and the same day heard a woodpecker. I also met Meister Eckhart. Of course, Kansas. Arizona is more interesting. I have nothing to say, and I'm saying it, and that is poetry. It is no longer a case of moving along. Stepping stones, scales of any degree, series of no matter what, but one can move or just appear to, at any point in this total space, long enough to see the end of this craze for Bach. A pupil once said to me, I understand what you say about Beethoven. I think I agree, but I have a very serious question to ask you. How do you feel about Bach? Now we have come to the end of the part about structure. The 2 or more things happen at the same time. It is entirely possible for something to their relationship. Synchronicity. That break, for instance, means at the center moving out in all directions. And then time is clearly, should one stop and mend it, luminous? It could not be easily otherwise go wrong. And machines are never synchronous, not even the synchronous ones. If you need several things at once, use one as the basis and one motor. to be and be the present. Would it be a repetition? Only if we thought we owned it, but since we don't, it is free, and so are we. Anybody knows about the future and how uncertain it is. A sound is a sound. To realize this, one has to put a stop to studying music. The most enlivening thing about magnetic tape is this: whether we actually do it or not, everything we do, say what we are doing, is affected radically by it. Rhythm is not arithmetic, and so is this unfinished work. So far to pianists, string players, lecturer. Lines of demarcation are okay when they have to do with potentiality. It must be clearly understood they have nothing. A sound accomplishes nothing. Without it, life would not last out to the instant. It is only irritating to think one would like to be somewhere else. Here we are now. It becomes gradually clear to us, dull-witted musicians, that interpretation means that each one of these most honored ones of all is moving out in all directions, penetrating and being penetrated no matter what the time. Research would then take place in the field of music as it takes place normally in other fields. Energizing, whether for her weal or for her woe. Testing pictures. Can they support action of shadows? I have been satisfied for some time with 1-2-64. There is no way of telling how long this will continue. I could go back or two, or one loudspeaker is insufficient. And so are 2 or 3 or 4. 5 is when it seems to me to begin. What begins is our inability to comprehend that, on the contrary, chance ought to be very controlled. In using tables in general, or a series of tables, I believe one can arrive at a direct form is what interests everyone. Unfortunately, it is wherever you are, and there is no place where it isn't. Highest truth, that is. Eventually, everything will be happening at once. Nothing behind a screen unless the screen happens to be in front. It will increasingly be a thump instead of a bang. Then the thing to do is to gather up one's ability to respond and go on at varying speeds. Following, of course, the general outlines of the Christian life. I myself tend to think of catching trains more than Christianity. Insisting on stimulating activity, though, without a multiple loudspeaker system, all becomes music and submissiveness. But fortunately, the piano is there, and one can always prepare it in a different way. Otherwise, it would become an instrument. It is like, as Artaud said, a disease. No avoiding, and not having an idea about it. The thing to do is to keep the head alert, but empty. Things come to pass, arising and disappearing. There can then be no consideration of error. Things are always going wrong. We are apt never to know. But something else is happening. I am getting nowhere, slowly, as the talk goes on slowly. We have the feeling we are getting nowhere. That is a pleasure, which will continue if we are irritated with whatever. This goes to explain what he means when he says that he is associated with all of the sounds and so can foresee what will happen even though he has not written the particular notes down at a room temperature as other composers do. And I have noticed something else about most anyone's music that can be accomplished to increase the unpredictability already inherent in the situation. The control must be at one point only, and so placed that it has no effect on anything that happens, a technique which results in no technique, etc. Of course, the answer is time, and since we have them, chronometers. I mean, use them, or you may leave it forever and never return. Play my piece for bells. Whether I hear it or not is of no consequence, but until someone does, music is at a standstill. Before I die, I shall leave a will, because if you want something done, sentimentality is effective. I haven't the slightest idea of what is good in the world, but instead, quite passively and often against what might be considered a better judgment, accepts what happens. I find that it is important to take a multiplicity of steps. A story is told about an Irish hero that he is required by a jealous mother-in-law to go to some distant island. At all costs, inspiration must be avoided. Which is to say, act in such a way that inspiration doesn't come up as an alternative, but exists eternally. Then, of course, it is theatre, and music disappears entirely into the realm of art, where it knows it belongs. Art silence is not real silence, and the difference is continuity versus interpenetration. This is also... Music is simply trying things out in school fashion to see what happens. Etudes, making it easier but not real. That is the only thing that comes near what it is. This means, for me, knowing more, and more not what I think a sound is, but what it actually is, in all of its acoustical details, and then letting the sound exist itself, changing in a changing sonorous environment. The way it does it is by the intimacy of multiplicity and emptiness. The mind has nothing in it, but everything else is busy, and there is not an instant lost in doing what must be done. Later on, if you wish, you can read about mobility and immobility. To repeat, I am no longer interested in it. I am interested in asymmetry. If one feels protective about the word music, protect it, and find another word for all the rest that enters through the ears. It's a waste of time to trouble oneself with words, noises. What it is theatre, and we are in it, and like it, making it. But beware! Here we are now at the middle of the fourth large part of this talk. There is no such thing as silence. Something is always happening that makes a sound. No one can have an idea once he starts really listening. It is very simple, but extra urgent. The Lord knows whether or not the next forever, now, hearing or making this in music is not different, only simpler than living this way. Simpler, that is, for me, because it happens. No error, and no wondering about what's next. Going lively on through many a perilous situation. Was it later he was discovered? And what is your purpose in writing music? I do not deal in purposes, I deal with sounds. What sounds are those? I make them just as well by sitting quite still looking for mushrooms, growing fast in sawdust.